Hey everyone, James from TeaDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. So this one's probably being released a little bit further in the future than I'm filming it, but going to be bringing on a Crimson Lotus tea today, which has been, it's always fun to have their tea. They do some good work here and they're locally based, so I'm happy to bring some of that stuff on. Those of you who may have tuned in, we did a live hour-long session with Crimson Lotus, myself and Glenn did on their channel. So please do check that out if you're not familiar. Nice long conversation, always fun to have tea with Glenn. I really enjoyed it, and he was kind enough to send me some of this tea from a cake that they have, which includes the wrapper, as well as a couple other samples, which I have not tried. But I'm filming this the day after actually we did the hour-long session while the tea is sort of fresh in my mind. Wanted to talk about it then, but also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of like the practice of blending kind of generally, as well as the practice in sort of more of the Western ripe blending context. So this tea is the Wei, as I mentioned. And it's interesting. I actually tried this tea the day before we recorded, sort of in preparation for that, just to sort of get a feel for the tea, do my work, and it stuck out immediately as just being stronger. So initially I was like, okay, is this maybe like a lighter fermentation product? But no, it actually had a strain of bitterness, and it turns out the tea is blended with some Lao Mane. And those of you that have seen some of the episodes, I have brought on the Lao Mane to both an in-between-sode and a normal episode with Denny. And I think for both Denny and myself, Lao Mane, even ripe tea, on its own is kind of a tough sell. It's just, it's one of the materials that seems like the bitter material from that area just seems capable of overpowering the ripe process, which is something that you're not really used to for other teas. It's like usually a ripe pu'erh will have certain characteristics, and the Lao Mane is almost just a totally different beast. So I think it's the sort of ripe pu'erh that might appeal to people that aren't actually normally ripe drinkers. It's just very much an atypical, different ripe pu'erh. But what is fun is having a blend, and I think that material, if you're going to use that material to make something that's more drinkable to myself and maybe to other ripe drinkers that maybe not quite so, not quite as much bitter lovers, blending it in really does help to create an interesting texture and depth to it, and different layers to the taste. So I'm a fan of it if it's used sort of in the right context. And so yeah, this tea uses some of that. It reminds me a little bit also of the Bawang from Yunnan Sourcing, which I'm also a fan of. Not sure if that tea blends in Lao Mane or not, but it definitely blends some stronger material that provides a little more punchiness to it. And just really layers the taste. Sort of in the episode, talking to Glenn too, we talked a little bit about the blend, and he talks about how it's a mix. It's a fairly bud-heavy blend as well, but it also contains some bigger leaves. Things like the buds tend to be a little bit more front-heavy, come out in the first few steeps, whereas the bigger leaves, they'll brew out a little bit more over time, which, you know, lines up with sort of my experience as well. It's like a lot of those Gongting, very small leaf, buddy pu'erhs, they can brew out very fast, whereas maybe something a little larger leaf, like a 8592, or stuff that uses more like big leaves, or even Huangpian, those actually can have some pretty long-lasting taste. But they might offer a lot less richness and intensity early on. I mean, one thing people really like about the Golden Needle White Lotus, I think, is that really rich, creamy texture, and that, of course, is famously a very small leaf, bud-heavy cake. So yeah, so going to be, so I actually quite enjoy this tea. I've had it just a couple times, so I haven't had it quite as much, quite as many repetitions as I normally do before I bring it onto the show. But wanted to showcase it here, and definitely check out that episode with Glenn. All right, let's get into drinking this tea. All right, so I am drinking this tea in my pretty normal context for an Inbetweenisode, so steep number 5 here, so already fairly into it. I'd say drinking this in the morning too, it's one of the ripes that really does stand out, and you can have it with food and still sort of taste the tea, which just kind of shows you that the material is quite strong, or at least some of the material is quite strong in it. So here is steep number 5. I'll probably do steep number 6 on camera as well. Gonna take a quick sniff. You know, earlier I feel like you could smell that sort of like really, I don't know, that Lao Mane does have a very distinctive taste and aroma to it. Can't smell it quite so much now. Smells a little bit more like a typical ripe here, here kind of in the mid steeps. So yeah, cheers. Still has a lot of that strength, predominantly sort of woody tones, a little bit of sweetness too. The bitterness is just well integrated in, which makes me like it. Also worth noting, this tea is a $45, so sells for 22 cents a gram or so. So definitely sort of qualifies in that sort of higher end ripe category, not as cheap as a 10 cent a gram dai cake or anything like that. And I think it is also a fair bit more interesting than those teas too. I'm also a fan of Munghai area ripe pu'erh, so Lao Mane, of course, is in that Munghai area, so I like having those sorts of characteristics in the tea. So doing steep number 6 here as well. I want to be sure to brew it for a fair amount of time. One of the other takeaways I had from my session with Glenn is he pushes the tea quite hard, so makes me a little more confident to do that. If this was the Lao Mane that Denny and I brought on to a episode, I definitely would not be pushing it this hard, as that tea is already, even at lighter parameters, it can be quite strong to brew. Alright, so getting, this does not brew the darkest, so maybe the fermentation is also slightly lighter. I would guess that things like the smaller batch fermentation for something like the Lao Mane probably tend towards the lighter rather than heavier fermentation. One way to look is just sort of to see the color of the spent leaves, as well as the color of the liqueur can be helpful too. Similar aroma coming to it, maybe a slight amount of creaminess. Yeah, nice texture to it, just really, really woody all around. Nice body. I'd say probably the first few steeps that I had this morning were probably a little more bitter than this, but it still is, it's still kicking. It's still kicking some of that stuff into it, that strength into it. Yeah, all right. Okay, and so just talking a little bit more about blending and stuff. I think it's sort of interesting to think about sort of purity versus blending as a concept. For me personally, I think purity is interesting to study and isolate, probably mainly in the context of younger tea to try. Personally, I think the better products, or my favorite products, certainly for the price, usually end up being blends, not just for ripe, but for raw too. I think you can run into the issue where a tea can age pretty singularly, especially if you're reducing sort of the size, you're like going down to like a small batch and then you're going to a small farm. So I really do appreciate that a lot of the Western vendors do focus on blending tea, and I think, of course, it can still be a danger that a tea can age pretty singularly, especially when you're working with just a couple different materials. But I think a lot of Western vendors do put a lot of thoughtfulness and stuff into that in order to create a blend that's interesting, and will hopefully age to have a bunch of different layers. I am a fan of what Glenn and Lamu have done with this one. I think blending Lao Mane for my personal palate is the right maneuver for sure. I think it's interesting and immaterial to taste. I think it's just much too strong for me, just on its own, both as a raw and as a ripe. One thing that these Lao Mane ripes have taught me is that I'm pretty unconvinced that a Lao Mane raw is going to age and mellow out very quickly, certainly not in my climate. So I definitely go for Marco style hot box or moving to a hotter climate if I were going to do that. Anyways, enough babbling. Let's do Steve number 6. Yeah, real nice. I'd say like that initial flavor, it's just like there's something about that Lao Mane that just initially greets you in a way that's just very different from sort of like that friendly greeting that a lot of ripe has, that's just a little more sweet and like soft and upfront. There's like a certain like grittiness to these Lao Manes that that can be fun, and I think something like this probably appeals a little bit more to the raw drinkers as well, just having that really strong strength rather than just being just so easygoing and creamy. And yeah, I think this is also probably an interesting tea to taste test versus some straight Lao Mane material from like Scott or from Glenn, who I think has some too, if I remember correctly. So yeah, just good. Even my wife noted that this has pretty decent strength and depth to it, and she's just drinking it while we're having breakfast together. So. All right, yeah, so I think that just about concludes this Inbetweenisode. Going to give it a 6.4 rating, so pretty decent overall. Definitely enjoy this tea. Thank you to Glenn for providing it to me. Definitely one to check out. Nice thing with Crimson Lotus is they are local, and you can get them to ship domestic, so you don't need to worry about, if you're US based at least, you don't need to worry about all the complicated logistics that has come to the international shipping. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Glenn, for this tea. Check out that hour-long conversation over on their channel, Crimson Lotus Tea. If you haven't, subscribe. Let me know what you would like to see more of in the future. Thank you for tuning in. Cheers.